morning. Welcome back to the AAIS Pulse. This edition, we'll be speaking with Brian Casey, who is the co-chair for the Transactional Regulatory Insurance Practice with Locke. I'm Robin Westcott, Vice President, General Counsel for AAIS. Good morning. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks, Robin. Nice to see you.
Great to see you as well. You are probably in more sunny Atlanta than I am in sunny Tallahassee. And I apologize if you guys are getting any feedback, but just a few seconds ago, it started storming here. So you may hear an occasional thunder clap, or you might hear the rain hitting against the back of the chimney. So my apologies if there's some background noise, but can't avoid the skies opening up on a live broadcast.
Could have used some AI for that.
Well, it'd be nice if AI worked really well for weather. But as we go along and as we start this session, we obviously are going to be talking about machine learning technologies and how AI and machine learning, artificial intelligence and machine learning will be really applied here as we move forward in the area of insurance. And as you just heard in the last session, open source with Phenos and the representations that were made there around how open source technology will apply, same types of practices and things will apply here going into using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Just recently in August, the NAIC adopted guiding principles for artificial intelligence, emphasizing the importance of accountability, compliance, transparency, and safe and secure, robust outputs. And this was based on the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, AI principles, which has been adopted in about 42 countries. And I believe this is just a preliminary discussion of what we can expect as regulators struggle to be able to regulate insurance contracts, specifically around unfair discriminatory practices, which is a tenet of the regulatory environment. So those 5 key tenets, fair and ethical, accountable, compliant, transparent, secure, safe, and robust, are going to be a tall order for regulators to really look at what's going on in the technology area. And so as we see these principles start to come forward, Brian, what do you think are some of the likely avenues that the regulatory environment will use to monitor compliance with the new AI compliance?
Good and very important question, Robin. I mean, probably initially there will be examinations after the fact, looking at conduct after the fact, as we do now and have for many, many years. That presupposes that the regulators know what they're looking for and understand a little bit what's under the hood, so to speak. Generally, I think translating the regulation of AI, if I can call it that, into real, practical, usable laws and regulatory practices is a tall order, as you mentioned. I think we'll get there. It may take a few years. Another method of monitoring would be some sort of self-compliance. That's what I would expect it to start out as, until the regulators have a better command of understanding what they're looking for and not looking for, and any violations of the principles that you articulated. By the way, if you go through all those principles, I think legal and compliance is mentioned in every one of the 5. So clearly a big focus from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I see it as being pretty difficult. I think that we really have hit a crossroads around the regulation and technology. Everyone you've seen with the work that's been done in the big data working group, in the information technology working group, regulators really struggle with how to get their hands around a lot of this newer technology and newer data elements that are coming in. And I think, from my perspective, the machine learning, artificial intelligence will probably be no different. We're going to struggle to have the really desired transparency that's needed to look deeper beyond the technology to see the application. So that kind of leads to, one of the main tenets around transparency in the new regulations or in the new proposed rules, guiding principles. And, I think it's going to be tremendously difficult to get that level of transparency that's needed. How do you see, and how difficult do you think it'll be, Brian, to get transparency around this type of technology and the use of it inside of the organizations?
Definitely a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I do believe that is one of the correct guiding principles in this area and many others, privacy included, for example. The flip side is that if it's my technology and I've spent millions or billions of dollars in developing the technology and enabling my workforce, be they remote or otherwise, I want to protect my intellectual property and the value of that I've developed. So that's the balance, I think, that we will all weigh in on and eventually have to come to terms with. But I do think some level of transparency is necessary, as reflected in the guiding principle, in order for customers, be they commercial or consumer in nature, to understand what is going on with their underwriting, their claims, whatever the particular process that might be involved from an insurance perspective.
Yeah, I don't see it as much different than the conversations we still have around models being used inside the industry. There's a level of proprietary information that are in those models, and it becomes difficult then to judge and to have that opened up. You can say, okay, well, we're going to call an audit, and the things that we find, that there's a protection there for the information that's collected during the audit. But it takes a great deal to look at the models, for example. I mean, Florida has the Commission on Loss Methodology that they review the models. I sat on that as the consumer advocate for a while. And, you had professionals from, different disciplines, whether it was meteorology, engineering, all kinds of professionals that actually went in and looked at the mechanisms of the model, and it protected that proprietary status. But it's very difficult to do that with every product, every technology, and every model that now is entering into our space. And so I think that's going to continue to be difficult, right? And I think that if you caught the earlier session on open source, I think open source is one of those technologies, is one of the platforms or the tenets that we have to become a lot more comfortable with in the insurance industry in order to allow that transparency around what's happening with the technology. In other words, outcomes, perhaps, same as we do with outcomes of a model. So you're going to evaluate and judge, you're going to start to have some of this open source or movement toward open source to be able to see that first layer of technology that's being applied, and to be able to really accurately look at the outputs that are coming out from some of the use throughout the industry. And I think, one of the suggestions that I've seen forward, not just the models, but some of the other types of reviews, is to have the advisory organization take on kind of a different meaning or space, and to start being kind of the clearinghouse or the filter for some of this technology. How do you see that, Brian? How do you see that going?
Well, maybe there's a new breed of advisory organization that's in the process of being birthed. I think that will likely happen. You know better than I do, Robin, how long some of these advisory organizations have been around, many decades. So I think they're learning a new trick, and rightfully so, in my opinion. Now, that said, we have yet to see whether there's going to be any regulatory proposals for increased regulation of an advisory organization that is conducting certain activities, providing data, licensing algorithms, and others that engage in very similar businesses that, are not currently regulated at all by insurance regulators.
Yeah, I see it as really difficult in some respects. I think there would have to be a lot of change around what is expected or anticipated from the role. Much like we've been monitored or audited over the years, there's an examination committee, especially for advisory organizations and statistical agents. And they really take a look at how we process data, how we create loss costs, the whole mechanisms inside of the advisory organization. So I think some of the principles are there. My problem with that is that I think it becomes very difficult for the advisory organization not to become just the center in a way that's not healthy for the market. We believe competition is healthy for the market. We think that the space has to have competition, but we also think that the nonprofit status that we've maintained over the years helps us to maintain that fairness or balance in the process. If your goal is to capture all of these tools and mechanisms and make them profitable for you, that's not a clearinghouse. That's not a true advisory service acting in a modern capacity. That's just capturing a marketplace. And we, at AAIS, we work very hard, especially with things like OpenIDL, which is moving as an open source technology, so that we're not capturing people, that we can allow that layer of transparency that the regulatory environment will need and give a level of comfort or security in the audit processes and how we are operating that technology. But ultimately, I think we have to have a fair and equitable space there that is still acting as that conduit between the regulator and the industry. And I think it's very difficult as if you're moving into or you're in a for-profit paradigm. I won't put you on the spot and make a comment about that, but I think transparency, though, it plays a key in all of this, in the ability to look at this technology, to understand it. And I welcome the opportunity as an advisory organization to be that clearinghouse, to be that conduit. But a lot has to change, starting, with the statistical data handbook all the way through the actual advisory organization charter laws. So that's going to be hard. One of the things, I'm going to pivot a little bit. One of the things that, I look at when I'm kind of seeing this new world is a real emphasis on state-based regulation being responsive. Is that possible? Or does it lend especially around a technology like machine learning, the application as you're seeing it, not just here, but like in the financial side, as we saw earlier today. But how important is this going to be that there's not a usurping of authority by the federal regulator? And how likely do you think that would be, Brian?
That's a great question. It kind of philosophically raises its head every 10, 15 years or so when there's a new impetus in town like there is here for technology. I have always been a firm believer in the state-based insurance system, of course, probably for some selfish reasons. But I think there are very valid reasons, whether it's based on insurance for, expertise, based on locale for coastal risk or hurricane risk, whatever the subject matter may be. And frankly, our insurance regulators, generally speaking, are good. They're hardworking. They like to learn. They have a lot of knowledge, of course, and industry-specific knowledge that doesn't exist at the federal level, notwithstanding the Federal Insurance Office and some of the intrusions on state regulation that came out of Dodd-Frank. So definitely, I think they're up for the challenge. They've done it before. You can look at the Interstate Compact, for example, on the life and health side, which at its core is a technology initiative, and NIPR for agent licensing. So, this isn't at a different level, I think, but I do believe that the insurance regulators will be the right group of body to lead that initiative.
Yeah, I agree. I think the state-based system has a lot to offer in just the ability to be flexible and responsive to the regional and state needs versus applying standards. They do have the organization through NAIC and others to create a uniformity, but allow for the states and the regions as they need to respond in certain areas. I mentioned earlier the big data working group, the information technology working group task force. There's a lot of different working groups kind of going on right now, different areas of technology and implementation and different ways of handling and looking at these new things coming into our environment. But one I think that's going to be particularly impactful upon the discussion around machine learning and artificial intelligence is the new special committee on race and insurance. And when they're looking at how things like underwriting rules and other things or interactions with the consumer very specifically are happening, I think that committee is going to be pretty pivotal in the discussion. What have you seen as they've started looking at this very important issue for our nation right now around race and equality?
Yeah, well, they just got started, as you know, so they have 4 or 5 different work streams, primarily based around lines of business. And really, they're, like I said, they're just getting started. So I do think that their work will be eventually very important on these issues we're discussing today in terms of machine learning and technology and artificial intelligence. But it's a much broader mandate and charge, as you know. I could see a subgroup developing under this new special committee, or they will augment with some of the work that's been done and some of the personnel that are on the 4 or 5 other technology-related committees that you rattled off there, Robin. But I do think AI and machine learning will be on the agenda for this committee sooner or later.
Yeah, I see that as especially impactful when you're looking at the way a customer is treated or the experience a customer has with an insurer. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the real unique applications that we see in the insurance industry. But I do think that as we look toward this, that we shouldn't forget that the major charge of the regulatory environment is to protect against unfair discrimination, right? It's we've had different discussions around the use of different proxies in rate making, but I think too we have to be really aware that just because you have a computer algorithm running your interaction or governing whatever it is that's going to affect that consumer, it doesn't mean that it's not a bias in the actual application. Because you can say, oh, a computer, it's a computer, it's neutral, it's not a person. It really depends on how it was programmed and what the person, the meaning, right, the intent behind the programming. Just like if you have something that collects a lot of garbage, a lot of garbage data, garbage in, garbage out, right? You're not going to have an output that's legitimate. And I think that the same thing, and I think some of the fails that we started to see with machine learning, especially around the underwriting and chat boxes and other things, they had some biases that were in there, but they also had a lack of understanding of really the interaction that happened between or in that underwriting environment or with the consumer. So I think that that's going to be very important, and we're going to have to really look at not just again outputs, right? What does that really do? Not just the program itself, but what does it really do? How does it really affect a consumer in the end? Because that's a regulatory job and always has been. There's special attention right now around race and gender equality, but I think that that's always been a tenet for us as regulators. And I still use the royal we. I apologize for mistaking it, but I think that's going to be important, and I think it's important to most of our colleagues. I think that it's an important tenet for the people who we work with as well. So. Brian, I see P&C and I see little slices of the industry and how AI machine learning is used. You see some other interesting applications. I'd like you to, if you could, just talk about some of the things and the ways that you've seen machine learning applied throughout our industry beyond just how we're going to have to comply.
Yeah, sure, Robin. Well, if you take a step back, I mean, there are a number of use cases or potential use cases. So I mentioned underwriting. To me, that's the most natural one, but that's just really coming from a lawyer. Claims, fraud, customer experience, cross-selling, cross-marketing. Those are 5 off the top of my head. People would rank them differently, of course, depending on their perspective. In terms of uses, I do think, so I think, in my view, underwriting is number 1. 2, I put fraud as number 2 in terms of ease of implementation, and cost benefit analysis. If you can improve fraud detection through AI and machine learning, I think that you can really save some numbers there in terms of expense. On the life insurance side, which is not really our audience here today, I mean, there's, accelerated predictive underwriting, trying to not use bodily fluids and use data from pharmaceutical reports and those kinds of things. That's getting a lot of action on the life side. And of course, telematics on the P&C side, both commercial and personal auto, I would put in the AI bucket if it can start modeling and expecting and thereby avoiding loss scenarios and crashes and injuries.
Yeah, I love the idea of being able to do fraud detection with the components of machine learning AI. I do think, however, it's going to be very important that the data that supports whether it's machine learning for that type of activity, fraud detection, it's going to take a bigger data set than just company by company. And again, I back to the open source. I think that's why open source technology is important. I think that some layer of that's going to need to be built as an industry standard and data applied in a standard fashion. Data applied through a standard so that you can actually use those mining tools, basically what they are, to start looking at interactions in the data. I think I think fraud detection is probably one of my top interests in using it. I also I agree with you. I think underwriting will probably be one of those things that we'll just see more expansive use, and basically, transition of model to using that technology to start to look at data. But again, it does to me, even in this realm, go back to data and how well we collect it as an industry, how well we actually look to making the interaction of data transparent. I'm not talking about everybody open up and make their data transparent, but the interactions of the data have to be more transparent in our industry. I think we will struggle to some extent with some of these tools if they're applied in a silo, right? If the siloing effect always kind of dampens the ability. I've got a weird noise going on there. I don't know what that was. But the siloing effect inside our industry and the inability to really work together to create platforms where we can share levels, maybe some level of data, but that has to be a great deal more efficient than what we see with statistical reporting and data call activity that we have right now. So I think, to some extent, we really need to kind of focus on that to make the efficiencies and the monitoring, the transparency of the tools themselves really work for us in our industry. So I'm gonna play off that for a second and talk a little bit about some of the things that we've seen from a compliance standpoint. We're using machine learning in a really different way. I want to get your reaction to this. But one of the things that we've been doing at AAIS is taking it from and using machine learning for a leveraging tool around our language, around our contract language. And I know that you're aware of some of the smart contract activities that are going on in other organizations and the standardization of some language. But we've actually used the tool, and I'll kind of go over what we're doing in a pilot for Connecticut here later on. But we're actually using the tool to start to look at whether a piece or clause is compliant with the state law, whether or not, and how it stacks up against other types of language from other contracts. And I think that's a bit of an untapped resource, right? We still do a lot of work like that, a lot of production work like that, very manually in our industry. And so I just, I'll kind of toss it to you to see, how do you feel about that? Do you think we need this to get to the next level on smart contracts and other things, this dissection?
Yeah, that's an interesting use case. I think there's, almost limitless use cases for all of us collectively, certainly in the legal and regulatory area. I mean, I have some friends at a employment law specialty law firm that are using artificial intelligence in conjunction with Georgia State University's risk management and insurance department to predict outcomes or even, likelihood of winning or losing a motion to dismiss or summary judgment of certain employment claims based on, the zillions of other cases that have occurred, not just decided with written opinions, but actually going into the briefs and in the motions that you don't always read every day, to look at those and help use those decisions and language as predictors of potential outcomes. In that case, for example, on contracts, if you're diligencing contracts on a mergers and acquisitions transaction and you're looking for change of control provisions, sometimes they have an extra clause that says not unreasonably withheld or delayed or conditioned, and you can use that sometimes to force what would otherwise be a non-consenting party, but being able to do that in a granular, more efficient, electronic way would be fabulous. So, I could go on and on and on, but lots of opportunity on your market conduct, for example. It kind of ties in with your language. So if I can somehow get the data to predict, well, I'm going to do this language change, tweak, is it going to be bad or good, or, am I more exposure to criticism on market conduct or less? So I like those kind of applications.
Yeah, it's a whole new world, and we're gonna wrap this up now and start opening this up for questions from the audience. So, as you see on your screen, audience, if you have questions, please feel free to submit those, and we will be monitoring those, and Brian and I can discuss. But first and foremost, my question: what's the most incredibly interesting application of AI for you?
For me or the audience?
Yeah, for you, Brian.
Oh. In the insurance area, I
not necessarily either one, anyone.
I do a fair amount of work with not only property casualty but the life side, and that the predictive underwriting is very interesting to me, and you can really, I can at least see that progressing. Not as fast as we probably all hope, but I can really understand that better than I can in some other lines, as an example.
Okay, we do have some audience questions. So do you think there will be new requirements in the audits of insurance companies to comply with AI principles? Brian?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. How and when we get there is a different question. Robin, as you kind of alluded to before, I mean, there's a big learning curve for all of us, including the regulators. So how do they know what they're auditing until they have some better understanding of what's going on underneath the hood? And we can say that about probably many of us, including me, that are participating here today. So there's a learning curve. There's also kind of a new human resource factor to all this stuff. So I think, as I mentioned, Robin, in one of our prior conversations, if I were going to law school right now, I would have a minor in data science, because there will be a new breed of legal and compliance professionals, which the departments need as well, frankly. So I'm sorry, I'm getting off on tangents on that, but
no, I totally agree. That's in fact, I never understood the power of data science, and our next session, that's a great segue for later when I introduce Phil Legrone around using data science to underpin some of the compliance work that I'm doing. So I completely agree with you. I think it would be, it's in everybody's best interest to kind of start to understand what that really is. And start to try to apply it in the things you're doing internally within your organizations. Those are the people who will help us get the transparency that we need in place to be able to use some of these technologies. So the next question, I think, is kind of for me. So what would be the biggest change for advisory organizations if there's a move toward using them to review new technologies like AI? Okay, so for me, the biggest change is not, I mean, we'll need law changes and we'll need other types of things to underpin that, to move that forward. The biggest change will be for our insurance companies, because right now they see it as an advisory organization, much as a vendor inside of the dichotomy, or our community. And they are going to, the insurance industry would definitely have to change its mindset around what a modern advisory organization should, could, and would do. We're not your vendor. We're your partner. We're a part of the community. We help support a community. I think that's a big leap for many, many companies. Brian, I'll let you kind of follow up on that if you have any other comments.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity for positive change for what an advisory organization has historically done. You made a couple of indirect references to essentially antitrust issues, right? Market power, those need to be thought through. Of course, we have somewhat of a special exemption, as you know, Robin, for the insurance industry. But if you take a step back, and I think you were touching on this earlier as well, Robin, I mean, regulating data providers, okay, that's, yes, I get a Fair Credit Reporting Act company and the legacy of that, but the large technology companies, and you know who they are, mostly on the West Coast, are not going to allow much regulation of them as a data provider, algorithm creator, whatever you want to call them. So we kind of have a pulling guard in front of us on some level for back to the federal regulation threat. So we have kind of a pulling guard, if I can use a football analogy on that. And then, which I think is good. And then we have to figure out our own house. Okay, how do we want this to work? What creates less risk of some kind of federalism, and what is going to be perceived by insurance regulators as a good system for what may or may not be called an advisory organization in the future.
Agree. We've been working pretty hard here at AAIS to lay some of that groundwork. We believe we should be, a conduit for the industry and try to provide solutions for everyone. We firmly believe that regulators are stakeholders for us as well, and there has to be community formed, and it's a very different. And I agree. Antitrust. We've had problems with that in the past. And it's led to some bad results for the industry around creating more things that inhibit modernization and development than have created pathways for it. So I think that's probably one of the things that I see as a major tenet going forward. Whoever does this, whatever format you want to take, whatever regulatory environment you are to create, whatever new organization you want to enable, you really have to rethink the situation we have around openness, and because we aren't going to have transparency unless we get to some level of that a little more. And we do it in other things. We have great trade organizations that operate throughout the industry that do try to get to level playing fields. You have consumer groups in the industry that also lend their voice to equitable treatment and equality of these companies. But I think we're going to have to focus on that more. One last question here, and this is a good one. It's a good closer. Beyond AI, what other new technologies are taking hold in the insurance industry? Brian?
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know, Robin, do you throw chat bots into kind of the AI box? I do.
Yeah, I kind of do, but they work a different way, and I think they have a great deal more impact on the initial consumer experience.
Yeah. I mean, look, like you, Robin, I'm a blockchain believer, a little more from the smart contract perspective. I put blockchain into three buckets. One, cryptocurrencies, which is kind of its own thing. How is it taxed? Is it a security? Smart contracts, and then everything else. But I am a proponent of smart contracts and for an intangible product or service, whatever you want to characterize insurance as, there is no reason why we can't adopt smart contract technology for this type of contract.
No, I absolutely agree. And that's part of the work that I've been doing is around, I think to get to the smart contract, we have two tracks kind of going at AAIS. We have the Open IDL, which is distributed ledger blockchain technology that centers around getting data into ways that we can actually leverage and use it for data regulatory reporting purposes. But that's just one use case, right? That's the first use case. But then we also have things around our technology, which we call Libraria, which is a clause library environment. And we have different technologies to break down language, because I don't think we're going to be able to create those smart contracts inside of a distributed ledger technology until we really break down and get some streamlined process around how we treat language in our industry. It's a very, obviously, we make those form filings. You have clients that make those form filings. And it's difficult, right? Because you have a lot of different interpretations throughout the states. So there's got to be a level of consistency for smart contracts to work right. So we have to think about the regulatory environment when we're talking about deploying smart contracts inside a distributed ledger. But I agree with you, 100% opportunity here.
I also like the IoT side of the world too, as we're so and ever becoming more device connected, that there's just a lot of opportunity for risk mitigation. We've been doing a lot in the even the commercial auto telematics space with integration of telematics and measuring driving behavior and insurance products. And it's a natural fit, and it seems like it's going to work pretty well.
Yeah. I agree. Last question. How do you recommend people get started with the AI and new technology? What's the first steps that they have to take?
Well, like many things over our respective careers, Robin, sometimes you've got to get the right team, the lawyers and the compliance people, the technology people, maybe it's a product distribution people. So you've got to get the right cross-section of skill sets from a company perspective and get everybody on the same page in terms of what are the opportunities, what are the priorities, what's the ROI, and that kind of thing. After you've learned a little bit about the underlying technology and done a little bit of your homework. And just to go back to the blockchain example again, I've been trying to pull some of my in-house counsel clients, many of whom are, at around the same age as I am. And they don't always talk to their technology people, about new stuff until it becomes a live issue. And I'm like, I'll come out, I'll do a lunch and learn. We could do it remotely, but we got to have your technology people in the room with us. Because if you think it's a good idea from a legal compliance perspective, that's great, but you're going to have to, convince your internal stakeholders as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the cross-pollination that you're talking about inside of your organization is a really great first step. The use cases that we see applied, like with distributed ledger technology with Open IDL, that's a discussion that your compliance, business people, and in IT staff inside of your organization need to be having together with us, with other people, with Brian. We need to have that interaction throughout the company to really understand the applications, the use cases, and get those things applied. So I agree with you, and I'd encourage folks. Brian's information is online. If you have some questions or want to contact him directly about talking about some of these things inside your organization, he's a great resource for the industry to have and to be present as you're trying to introduce this inside your organization, because it's going to be very important of the conversations you have internally about this. So use those resources, like Brian, like myself, happy to always answer any questions. Member, non-member, always obliging. Thank you again, Brian, for being with us today. I very much appreciate your time. And we certainly hope to see you in person soon at some of these conferences, if we can get back to the new normal. But it was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.
My pleasure, Robin. Thank you to you and the other producers of the Pulse event. I'm going to sign off and actually listen to some of your other sessions this afternoon while I'm doing some billing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. See you soon.
Have a good afternoon.
We mentioned earlier in what we were doing with Brian, and I think maybe even in the open source environment, that we have some projects going on around our grander initiative library, what we call Libraria, which is a clause library inside of AAIS, and we use tools like Alfresco. John mentioned that earlier. Alfresco is a base business transactional platform, and we've added some interesting tools to it, a workflow we call HPI. But then we also have a technology called Kira. And Kira is one of the many tools that can be used on an Alfresco platform. But for AAIS, we started by taking all of our content from our forms library and putting it into the clause library or into this tool, Kira. And we started parsing it and looking at clause by clause, how each compared across different other people's products, how we compared with ourselves across our product lines. And it gave us a really interesting narrative around side-by-sides, which is a very labor-intensive process right now for our industry. But it gave us some immediate output so we can produce side-by-sides very, very quickly. So in using that and bringing that forward, one of the things we started to do was work with the state of Connecticut. And Andy Mace and George Bradner, of course, Commissioner Mace is heading the committee, the special committee on race for the NAIC, who's just an extraordinary man and is really also very supportive of technology industry. So he and George Bradner there at the Connecticut department have been entertaining the Kira product with us for a little over a year to look at how we can actually use machine learning, artificial intelligence for their pilot project of looking at different filings and for compliance as they come into the department at Connecticut. So I'm going to share my screen. First and foremost, we took the checklist, which you're seeing now, and we started to chain the machine with certain examples that the certain things that should have been filled out and should have been provided in this filing checklist, but sometimes is not done so well, is in the can be seen in the actual filing itself. So the output looks a little like this, and what we've done here, or you can see some of the training that we did. So the 30+ days automatic ERP coverage. And the neat thing, or the new thing that we have with this Kira component is it has the ability to be trained to answer yes or no as to whether the appropriate clause was found in the filing or not. So here are all, this is just a list of the things that we started treating or training the machine with 10 or 15 examples of where it did appropriately or it did not appropriately appear in the actual filing. So, for example, for each one of these, you can see here on the output looks a little like this. The 30-day ERP coverage, we have yes, it is represented in the text, and you see the text at what page in the filing that you can find the actual language that addresses this ERP requirement, and then highlighted over in the text is where it is the actual text itself. So this is what the filing actually said. And then likewise, I have an example here of where it did not meet. So we've taught the machine how to recognize when it did not meet the 30+ day automatic ERP coverage, right? So again, you have a place here. We had so many good examples of it actually passing that we had to kind of dummy one up and make it not pass. But we actually have where in the actual provision that it did not, that the language did not meet the specific wording and requirement of the statute. So here's another one, retroactive date advance. Did it meet it? Yes. Where was it? Page 17 of 27 in the filing. very quick look at what it said, but here it is in the context of the document. And then you can't see it from here because we're not in the actual live version. These are just screenshots. But this little button here by the actual retroactive date advance, if you clicked on that, it would actually have the requirement that was there from the actual filing checklist. What is this supposed to say? So that, that gives you the information of what is this supposed to do? Did it do it? And if it did it, where did it do it in the document? If we can get to some of these preliminary reviews and get regulators the ability to use this kind of technology, speed to market becomes real. And this first level review that we see from the insurance regulator can be automated to some extent, which means that we can run this same analysis on the filing before you file that to see where you're at in the scope of have you really met all the requirements in the filing. This does not take the place of real introspective analysis around contract language, but it is a really great first start to automate some of the things that have been very manual for us in the review process, and for compliance professionals to be able to submit those filings with a reasonable certainty and confidence that they really met the baseline requirements of a department. So I think Connecticut is really excited to get this technology inside of the department. Where we stand right now is that we are working with Kira to be able to download what we call a sub-instance. So all the things we've taught the machine around the provisions and the provisioning of contract language, loading that into a separate standalone technology tool for them to interface with online. We'd love, and we are structuring this because we are a modern advisory organization, that you won't need us forever to support this technology. We will be supporting this technology. We will be creating new provisional models and new use cases for the use of Kira, but it's not going to restrict you as a regulator or you as a company to start doing new and innovative things with this tool as well, using 2 years worth of AAIS's work in teaching this AI machine learning tool insurance contract language. So I'm going to pivot here very quickly and start to introduce something that you're going to see here coming up on the next hour. Over the past 6 months, well, as we've gone into the post-COVID world, very quickly AAIS was able to respond. Since we are a remote organization anyway, we were able to implement our pandemic plan, send everyone home. Everyone already had appropriate technology, so we had kind of a leg up on a lot of the industry and a lot of folks in being able to really work remotely. As you saw in some of the previews earlier, we were one of the first live events with the AAIS main event to go online. And that was a great success and one of the first in the industry. So what we did also is, as we're looking at different tools and different technologies that we're using, like the Libraria tool, and as I mentioned earlier, some of the greatest new additions to AAIS have been around our data science team. We started looking at some of the things that we do as a compliance organization, as a monitoring, not just for us internally on how we change our products, because we have to do that as well, right? Every time the law changes, or every time there's a new provision, we have to make sure our product lines with all our commercial and personal lines products remain compliant. Well, one of the challenges that the industry is going to face very quickly is how we keep on top of all of the new regulations and requirements that are going to center around the COVID-19 crisis. And so one of the things that we thought we would do is work with our data scientists to create some pathways and some tools that our members and non-members can use to start to look at how the COVID information can be viewed in a real interactive environment and tool. So one of the first things we did was we started, as we always do, monitoring all of the memorandums, information filings, and things like that that are happening in our industry, and actually put them into a really great tool that can be used. And again, our data scientists have been just amazing at what they can do when you give them information and how the way they can actually display it and bring it to be real. inside of the organization. So at the next hour, if you're curious right now, you can go to the AAIS COVID-19 Pandemic Resource Center. If you just Google it, you can find it. And we'll have two different tools in there. One will be the actual regulations, and then the other tool is one around tracking certain types of litigation, especially around the business interruption coverages. And it has some really great tools and interesting insights getting down to the trial courts and what's happening around litigation. Let's go back over here and stop sharing for a second. Bear with me. Okay. So as we move forward in the next top of the hour, we'll be joined by AAIS is Phil Lagrone, who is the head of our data and actuary solutions. And he'll be speaking with Jeff Waters, who is a senior product manager at RMS, and which is a leading cat risk solution company. And during that time, they'll explore the risk awareness services that AAIS is developing, and some of the partnerships we formed with companies like RMS to bring risk awareness tools to our members and to the regulatory community as well. So that is some of the exciting things that will be coming for in the next hour. Looking forward to hearing Phil and Jeff speak about these things and further explore some of the tools that AAIS is using. Thank you again for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. Hope to see you again at the top of the hour for the next segment on risk awareness at AAIS.